Okay, so I was looking through some comments recently, and apparently, side note, I guess I had turned off my notifications somehow. I wasn't getting email notifications. I just thought I wasn't getting comments as I was a bit MIA, but apparently I was, and there are a lot that I might want to look at because it's fun to respond to comments. But there was one from recently that, since this person's actually probably still around, I thought I would answer this because I was about a book into responding, 4 paragraphs or so, responding to, and I realized I should just make a video. This is gonna be real off the cuff, but this was from the Key of Life. They asked, "What are your thoughts on the carryover from slow practice to fast playing?" They carry on. "I feel from a pedagogical standpoint, slow practice can ingrain inefficient motions that won't work when playing fast. On the other hand, most piano learners don't get anywhere near the level that matters." Okay, so we'll start with that last little bit, and I totally agree with that. I think most people aren't going to get to a point where at the extremes it matters. Like, it's one of those things I'm on the record talking about this with scales. I think people worry way too much about velocity with their scales when in reality, they'll almost never apply that to anything. And it takes a lot to maintain your scales at an incredible velocity and just for no benefit. And you could be spending that practice time on so many other things that are more valuable. Um, and, even for what I do, it's so rare that I run into things that are at the tippy top of tempo, speed stuff. Like, I don't need crazy velocity very often. It's just not a thing that comes up a lot. So for most hobbyists, they're almost never going to run into it. Well, I mean, a lot of hobbyists want to jump into extremely difficult repertoire too quickly, but that's a whole other thing. But let's back up about this idea that slow practice can ingrain inefficient motions. I want to say that I feel the opposite, but I will say that I understand how that 100% can be true. And the difference comes down to how much you're paying attention to what you're doing. If you're practicing slowly all the time and you're doing it kind of mindlessly, 100%, like you're not doing anything to help you increase your speed. I mean, this is another reason I think it's kind of silly how often people will do things like scales practice every day. After they've been playing piano for 8 years, they start every day the same, playing their scales at whatever tempo. It doesn't even matter. They're not thinking about what they're doing anymore. Like, that's not a thing where they're consciously putting any thought into it. And so that's where the problem comes. Yeah, you can play slow and not pay attention, and you're not going to get any better. But the benefit of slowing down, actually, let's back up. I'm more afraid of people trying to play quickly because what I think they'll ingrain is tension. Because if you're trying to play really quickly without figuring out how to play more efficiently, you'll have lots of tension. So anyway, the benefit of slowing down a lot is that, for one, you just have more mental bandwidth to pay attention to what you're doing. So now you can look at your hands and you can think, what is it that's giving me a problem? So let's say that you run into a point where you're up against a speed barrier, a tempo plateau. Back the metronome off 40 beats a minute, or you don't have to have the metronome, but roughly back down that far, and then pay attention to what your hands are doing. Like, actually move your hands and see what's going wrong. So I guess the stereotypical example on piano of one of these things that I think a lot of people can run into, or maybe it's one of the first things that people run into, is with scales and thumb crossing, right? So it'd be really easy for somebody. I won't be able to play this correctly because, like, I don't play like this, so it's hard to emulate poor choices in technique. But they're playing a scale, and let's say even they're doing it fairly quickly, right? Sorry, I was just talking and playing, not so great. But somewhere along this motion, they get here, even at that tempo, and their thumb is way over here. And now they have to, like, jerk their whole hand to get their thumb in place. And it's just one of those things where if they slow down, they might go, oh, my thumb's hanging out over here. I can get it there much faster. So that's just about paying attention to what you're doing so that you can fix the problem. And that's not just picking one tempo and doing that, but it's actually applying it all the time. Like, you just need to be paying attention to what's happening. And, it's actually common for pianists to recommend the exercise where you just do the quick motion, right? Like, play the scale slow, but just do the thumb crossings quickly so you can think about those. That kind of thing, but probably maybe with a little less heavy thumb. I mean, it's good to throw in that accent maybe at first, but then try to, even it out dynamic-wise. And that's great because that lets you really focus on how quickly can you move that thumb. Because at the highest tempos, yeah, you really need to book that thumb under there. But I would say if I'm playing slowly, if I have this, very slow melody, I'm not doing that whippy thumb thing. My thumb doesn't need to move that fast. Now it's moving before I get to the F, right? Well before it needs to cross, but I'm not creating extra tension by trying to move it really fast at a slow tempo either, because I don't need to do that. And I'm always trying to, remove tension. But it's one of those things where along the way you just need to, the faster you play, the quicker you need to, you need to get your thumb across there. You need to cross a little faster and a little earlier, and you get to feel where that's at by just doing it at a lot of tempos. And this is a thing where I ran into the problem of practicing fast and ingraining the wrong things. And that's with guitar. Because when I first picked up a guitar a long time ago, just not in any serious way, I learned the handful of open position chords like people do. And there just really was a tempo. There was a point where I just couldn't make the changes any faster. And it still actually haunts me now, the mistakes that I have ingrained, the habits I've ingrained into my playing, and I've had to kind of deconstruct it. But I just couldn't figure out why I couldn't get any faster, and I also just had a ton of tension in my hands trying to make these super fast changes. It's only much later, playing a little more seriously, diving a little bit into classical guitar, not for classical music, but just classical technique overall. And realizing how much, there's just little efficiency of motion things that I wasn't doing. And there were things I wasn't paying attention to. So now I might work on one of those chord changes, and I would think about what each finger is doing during that change. What is my pinky doing? Then what is my ring finger doing? And so on, where I'm actually thinking about each one of those, and I notice which one is the laggy one, which one is going first, which one's going last. Because technically they're all going to go in a sequence, but in the long term, that sequence is so fast it's basically instantaneous and they're all moving at the same time. But you have to figure out what that is, and you have to slowly build that up. There's so many little things like that where it's just figuring that out, or figuring out, oh, my pinky's flying away. Why is that happening? And then realizing I have to work on a completely different exercise, where I'm trying to keep my fingers from flying away when I'm playing one finger per fret or whatever. And that all, sort of trickles down to better technique overall. But yeah, I had been practicing only fast. I never thought to practice those things slow. I thought, if I want to make these changes faster, I just need to practice them faster. And it was the opposite. I needed to slow down and actually pay attention to what I was doing. And that helped. So the thing is, it's another thing that I thought about. I hear this argument a lot from the piano world only. The idea that running and walking are different. They're different motions. You can't just walking fast is not going to teach you to run. And I get what they're saying, and 100%, I really get this, because let's say I get on a treadmill. I can set it to 3 miles an hour, and I can walk pretty nicely. 3.5 miles an hour, you're kind of power walking a little bit. You put it somewhere around 4.5 miles an hour, you're in this awkward spot where you can't really run or jog and you can't really walk. It's this kind of in between speed that's kind of hard to move at. So I get what they're saying, because it's a really different motion. There's a different motion between a run or a sprint and walking. But I really do only hear this in the piano world. It's weird because almost nowhere else would somebody say, "Man, you know what your problem is? You're slowing down too much. You need to practice faster." Like it just doesn't happen. And I have a theory about why that is, and I'll get to that in a minute. But let's talk about that run versus walk thing. In wind playing, there's this idea of tonguing. When you articulate a note, right? You have to tongue that note. Here, I'll grab an ocarina, right? So that's tonguing, right? That's articulating. The notes are breaking, right? But there's a point where you need to tongue faster, and I'm not gonna do it on the ocarina. I'll just talk through this. But you need to tongue faster, and your single tongue can only go so fast. And people can definitely get faster than that. But then you eventually have to double tongue, where you have a ta, right? And for a lot of people, that's a real. And the problem ends up being that there's this tempo gap in between where they don't have control. They can only go, and they don't really have control of that ta. So they'll have their single tongue up to about 110, and then their double tongue starts at about 140. What happens when you get a piece of music in front of you that's at 128? And it happens all the time. This is a big issue that I run into on trumpet, and people have this problem where, like, anywhere in that tempo range, they don't have a tongue that can do it. And what they need to do, I mean, for one, you can push your single tongue up a little more and find strategies for little bursts of speed, but that's in the weeds. The more important part is you need to bring your single tongue or your double tongue down. You need to have control of it at all the tempos. And there's a lot of gradation in between, and you need to be able to cover all of that, because in music you're going to run into all of it. I often talk about this with why I suggest people always play through things like retards or rubato. Play everything in time, at full speed, at your target tempo, and then worry about those things later. Make sure you have the technical ability to play at that speed. Now, for me, if I'm an accompanist and I practice something and I'm like, okay, we're going to retard here. So I always practice it with that retard because it's really dense during the retard. And then I get into a rehearsal and that conductor decides they don't want to use that retard. They're just going to blaze through it, but I can't play it any faster than a multo retard. That's a problem. But it's also a problem for like a solo pianist, right? If you're playing something and your musical decisions, your rubato, is entirely determined by how quickly or slowly you can play a passage, you're really locked in. That's not you making a musical decision. But if you can play it at any tempo, and you have control at all of those tempos, now as you're closer to the end, you're not thinking about all the notes individually. You're not thinking so much about your hands. You have everything, in control. Now you can say, how do I want to shape this phrase, and how do I want to do this? And yeah, you probably will have done a good deal of thinking about it musically leading up to that point before you're there 100% technically. But now at the end, if you have all that technical control, you can really play with lots of different ways of attacking that and playing it with very different interpretations if you want to. But if you are limited by the speed you can play it at because you only practice at that one speed, yeah, you don't have any choices. So it's really good to be able to play at all the tempos. And just like on trumpet, you have to be able to play at all the tempos. Now, my hypothesis about why this is a particularly insidious thing that I only really see pop up in the piano world is because pianists, more than other musicians, are very performance focused. They are worried a lot about this one piece of music they're going to play. So in their mind, why would you ever need to play this burst of notes from some cadenza any slower than the maximum tempo? And so to them, it's about a full-on sprint. They only need to learn that motion in a full-on sprint. They never need to learn it at other tempos. And I just think that's a really bad way to look at it, because you might. I get that they think that one piece is the only thing where it matters, but you'll be better at the instrument overall if you can actually play it at a variety of tempos. And when you encounter things at different speeds that are a similar figure, now you can do it. So yeah, I don't know that I buy the walk versus run argument. Like, in music, you just need to have all of them. You need to be able to have a very smooth gradation between all of those things. And, everybody else, other instrumentalists, that they just go in with that mindset from the start. Yeah, I occasionally see it sometimes with wind players. I have, like, my wife has some clarinet students who occasionally, they're getting ready for like region auditions. And so in their brain, the only thing that matters is this one audition that they're doing, right? And so it's the tempo they need it for that audition. And they don't want to take a step back and figure out what their weaknesses are technically in the etude and just work on those outside of the etude, work on them more broadly as part of their technique, work on them at a variety of tempos. But I can tell you, just like from the history of her students who have been extremely successful all-staters, they're the ones who did. They practiced their etudes, their extremely fast etudes, at really slow tempos in every step along the way, and they had 100% control at that full tempo. Whereas the kids who just keep blasting it at full tempo, they fall apart. A lot of times during auditions, they do not have 100% control. They lack consistency. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it does just come down to paying attention. You could absolutely dig yourself a hole of only being able to, ingraining slow motions that never translate to faster motions if you're just mindlessly repeating things slowly. But if you take advantage of the mental bandwidth that slowing down gives you, then you can make everything efficient at all the tempos, and you'll just have a lot better control. And yeah, so those are my thoughts on that. So I'll leave it there.